All right, let's get rolling. So thank you everybody for joining both in person and on Zoom. I'm Courtney Bobson. I'm a research scientist here at ONRC, and I am not often in person for these evening talks, so I'm grateful to be here with you all today, and excited to introduce Ali Kruper. Ali has been with ONRC in various capacities for the last 4 or 5 years. She did her undergrad at the University of Washington in environmental science and resource management. And she was one of our undergraduate interns here at ONRC and spent the summer out in Forks, working in the woods and learning a lot about what we do here at the center. After that summer, she did her senior capstone on locating red alder using remote sensing that she'll talk all about in a minute here. And actually ended up publishing the paper as an undergraduate student. I recently graduated undergrad, so really wonderful and impressive work. And we were desperate to keep her around ONRC. And thankfully, she wanted to do a master's degree, so she joined with ONRC and finished her master's. And a lot of what she'll present today, locating Western red cedar, is work that she has been doing for the last 2 years through her master's program. And now she is a research analyst here at the center, and we've managed to hold on to her as long as we can. And yeah, I'm excited to hear what she's gonna tell us about this evening. So without further ado, Ali, you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Courtney, and thank you all so much for coming here in person or online and joining today. As Courtney mentioned, my name is Ali Kruper. I'm a researcher here with the University of Washington Olympic Natural Resources Center, although I personally am based in Seattle. And I love coming out here, of course. The title of my talk is Wales Waldo Western Red Cedar Edition, Locating Cedar Using UAV LiDAR and Multispectral Imagery.
I just pointed at the projector. Okay.
Maybe we'll, I think I clicked off PowerPoint. Okay, there you go. Oh, I was just pressing the wrong arrow. We got this. To start, I'm just gonna start with a presentation overview so you guys know the roadmap and where we're going with this. I'm gonna start with an overview of remote sensing, just kind of in general in the field of forestry. And this is not, I should say, meant to be like a comprehensive view of all remote sensing in forestry. This is just kind of the bigger data types that you see and the scales at which you can achieve this data. And then after I do that, I'll talk about specifically a study that I did for my master's thesis on locating Western red cedar specifically using LiDAR and multispectral imagery. So I'll get a little bit deeper into those types of remote sensing in particular. I'll talk about the importance of Western red cedar and why cedar as a species particularly and where the study came from, goals of the study, methods, results and discussion. And then I'll kind of finish with taking a step back again and looking just at the general benefits and challenges of remote sensing in forestry. So to start, remote sensing and upland forestry. These are two very broad different data types that you see in remote sensing. On your left here, we have imagery, on the right, LiDAR, and I'm going to take a second here and just go through LiDAR a little bit more. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. Basically, in this example here, we have a plane that's flying over an area. It has a LiDAR sensor on it, and that LiDAR sensor shoots down laser pulses. Those laser pulses bounce off forest, buildings, whatever is below it with a certain speed and intensity, and using those pulses, we can create what we call point clouds, which are 3D representations that are all of the points that bounce back. And again, each one of these points, each one of these little dots in the picture here are points, laser pulses that bounce back with a certain speed through half of that point and also the height that point hits. And so here, for instance, we have a LiDAR point cloud clipped just to an individual tree. It is colored. LiDAR doesn't have a classic like red, green, blue colors. Instead, in this case, it is colored by height. That's the LiDAR. On the other side, we have within imagery, your classic red, green, blue imagery. This is just like your classic picture. We have multispectral imagery. Multispectral gets in within your classic electromagnetic spectrum. We have the visual image, the visual colors that we as humans can see, and then there are other colors, like for instance, bees can see an ultraviolet to help them find pollen. So with multispectral, we're getting out of the range of colors that humans can see and into, in this case, for the study we'll be talking about today, the red edge band and the near infrared band. And in this color, this is called a false color composite image. It's using near infrared, red and green bands, and for near infrared in particular, vegetation really pops. It really reflects that color. And then a final example of imagery remote sensing that I hear here is called photogrammetry. And that is where you take a bunch of different 2D photos and you combine them all at once in a way that creates a 3D imagery. So for instance, you might have a tree that you take a picture from all angles of the tree, and then you can slice those together and get what is essentially a 3D image. And for the study that I'm talking about today, the Western Red Cedar study, that uses LiDAR and the classic red, green, blue imagery, and then also the multispectral. I'm just highlighting those. Okay, I've got one more slide on general background of remote sensing. So there's kind of different levels that we can get this data, both LiDAR and imagery. At the top level, we have spaceborne, so that's like satellite. If you pull up Google Earth or Google Maps with the satellite view on, that's what we're talking about here. Going down kind of closer to the ground, we have airborne. This can be manned, so that's in a plane or a helicopter, or unmanned, which would be a drone. And then even further down to the ground, we have terrestrial. So this is actually data that's being taken on the ground. And that comes in static. So that would be just like if you had a camera on a tripod that's just sitting in one place. And then we've got mobile. And mobile is typically, that can either be a human with like a backpack that's wandering around, or a car that's driving, say, down a street. You can think of Google Maps when you go into Street View, and sometimes you see those cars driving around with the camera that work for Google that is taking the pictures for that Street View. So these are just general levels. And as we go down this upside down triangle, a few general patterns happen. One is you tend to decrease your spatial coverage. So if you're in a satellite looking down at the Earth, you're covering a lot more of the Earth than, say, if you're a human on the ground. So you can think like if you're in an airplane and you're looking down on a forest, you can see giant chunks of the forest and the Earth at one time, compared to, again, if you are just wandering around the forest and you see your immediate surroundings. So you're decreasing your spatial coverage as you go down this upside down triangle. You also tend to, and this is just in general, not a hard and fast rule, but you tend to be increasing your cost. And by that, I mean the cost to you as a consumer acquiring this data. I don't know much about how to get a satellite up in the air, but I'm assuming that costs a lot. But there's a lot of like NASA funded programs that already have a satellite in there, and they give the data to the public for free. Or you might have a company that sends out a satellite, and there's the business model to have, you know, hundreds of thousands of users each pay a small chunk to be able to access certain data. You get down basically into these lower levels, and with your decreasing spatial coverage, you're increasing the chance that you have to contract with someone to cover your specific area of interest. For instance, if you have like a plot of land, in the state of Washington, the Washington State Department of Natural Resources has a LiDAR portal where you can download freely available LiDAR, usually from a plane, for any area in Washington, typically in the past like 5 to 10 years that the data was acquired. But if you say want to have a drone flight over a plot of land, probably that's not been done before, or is not going to be done by a government agency that's going to give you the data for free. So you're going to have to contract with someone and pay money specifically for that data acquisition. And same as you get down into the more like terrestrial, LiDAR, terrestrial imagery, you're gonna have to own the equipment to go and do that or contract with someone who does. So you tend to increase your costs. So both of these seem more negative, right? Decreasing spatial cover and increasing cost, but what you really get that's positive is increasing resolution. The closer you get to something, the clearer it becomes. And I have some examples here of each of these types. This is just a screenshot I took of Google Earth, just of a forest, road, classic. You might be able to see things like, oh, is this a deciduous tree or an evergreen tree? But you're not going to be able to see more than that. Comparatively, this is an example of a LiDAR point cloud from a drone, so a manned flight. And you can see within this, and I'm going to try and move the cursor so those online can see what I'm talking about too. You can see individual trees, and you can also start to see tree species. Like right here, I can tell that this is a western hemlock because of its droopy top. And so with this increasing resolution, you can start to ask new questions, like not only is this an evergreen or deciduous tree, but also what species. As an example of terrestrial LiDAR is very cool. Because it's taken underneath the canopy, you start to get really good stem hits on trees, and you can start to do things like automatic DPH or diameter, breast height, the size of the trees you can automatically get with some of these terrestrial LiDAR acquisitions. So these are very general, and there's always trade-offs involved here, right? So depending on your goal and what you want to do with the data, like for instance, if you want to look at mapping wetlands across the continental US, right? You're gonna tend to need like satellite from maybe airborne, but probably that's too small of a spatial size. So you're gonna want more satellite data. So depending on your question, you're gonna want different options. And then I want to highlight here for the study that I'll be talking about today. This is using unmanned LiDAR and multispectral imagery. So that's again flown with the drone. And I'm going to talk more about that right now on the LiDAR side of things. Here is an example, and this is actually a video, which hopefully are good to play, of a point cloud from a UAV, which stands for Unmanned Aerial Vehicle. This is zooming in on a forest, kind of like twisting the point cloud at the moment, setting out the top-down view, and then this is more of a side view. So we really get with the LiDAR nice 3D imagery. And with UAV or drone LiDAR, you tend to get much higher resolution compared to, say, LiDAR that comes from a plane, where you might get 8 to 20 pulses per meter squared. This, we have an average of about 1,000 pulses per meter squared. And you can really start to see different species and things, which is what I'll be talking about today. There's a cedar in here, but I think I missed it when it was spinning. Okay, the other type of remote sensing imagery used in the Western Red Cedar study was multispectral imagery, which I mentioned before, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about now. I mentioned again before an electromagnetic spectrum. We can see within that visual spectrum, the multispectral is just outside of that into the red edge and near infrared. This is another example of here on your left, we've got just a true color imagery, so that's your classic red, green, blue bands, and then the multispectral just adding in near infrared. And again, vegetation in particular tends to really reflect in the near infrared. This is an example with like stressed leaves, dead leaves are reflect significantly less than say a healthy leaf. And for this study in particular, the multispectral imagery metrics that I used is I combined these different color bands together in different indices, which have been shown in the past to be correlated with things like vegetation, health. And I'm not going to get into this table because it has a lot of equations, but I'm just throwing that out there. So that was a bunch of remote sensing things. Now we're gonna take a step back and dive more into the study, more background into how this identification mapping project came to be, and also why Western red cedar. So how the study came to be. Most of the data from the study came from the TP watershed experiment, which is a collaboration between ONRC, the Olympic Natural Resources Center, and Washington State Department of Natural Resources. The TP watershed is a 20,000 acre study designed to test alternative management prescriptions. And a big part of the TP study is what we call our ecosystem well-being framework. In this framework, we put community well-being on the same level as environmental well-being and consider them both essential to achieve overall ecosystem well-being. And in order to do all of this, we need to engage people. And the process that we use to engage people is called learning-based collaboration. And learning-based collaboration we define as where managers, researchers, tribes, and stakeholders engage with one another to address management questions and options. So it was through this process of the TP watershed study and learning-based collaboration where a lot of the TP prescriptions and treatments came to be. And in particular, this study idea came from Courtney Bobson, who did my introduction, talking with someone from the Philly Tribe Natural Resources Department about what they wanted to see on the landscape. And what came out of that discussion really was cedar. And so we worked with the Philly Tribe Natural Resources Department throughout this project. A little bit more about cedar in general. I use it interchangeably, Western red cedar and just cedar. The scientific name is Tujaprata xdon, Don xdon. Cedar is interesting because it's kind of a generalist species. You can find it on the edge of forests, within forests. It can mostly more shade tolerant. It can be shade intolerant. And it typically doesn't really grow in monocultures naturally. It has a relatively slow growth rate. And it importantly has really great cultural, ecological, and economical importance. And I'll go more into the cultural importance in the next slide, but ecologically, it's very long-lived, large diameters. I'm sure we've all seen this, especially more old growth habitats. It can be really great habitat for birds, great for carbon sequestration, all of that fun stuff. And it's a very high timber valley species, also very important. Cultural importance, a little bit more. It's considered a cultural keystone species. It is highly important to many tribes across the Pacific Northwest, and it's used by tribal members both historically and today for a variety of reasons. Here we're just naming a few. You can use boxes, houses, mats, clothing, medicine, and so much more. As an example of me doing some cedar work stripping, the Philly Natural Resources Department was so kind to invite us out this year with them. Okay, so cedar is, as I mentioned, a very important species, and it's also a species that we have a lot less of on the landscape today than we did historically. So the importance combined with the decreased abundance on the landscape makes this a particular species of interest. And so I'm going to talk about why we have less of it on the landscape. One is just over-harvesting in the 20th century combined with the slow growth rate. Another is there's a lot of problems with ungulate browse, so browse by deer and elk of cedar saplings. And if a deer kills cedar when it's young, not only is that cedar not going to survive to adulthood, but it also is less likely to be planted in the first place because the manager is, uncertain about its survival. There's also been a documented dieback. I'm sure a lot of us have seen just unhappy cedars around in the past few years. And there's actually a group out of WSU Puyallup who's been working on the physiological reasons for this. And evidence is still coming out, but it seems to be tied to the drought that we've been having the last few years and the decreasing snowpack. And then finally, there's just a fundamental incompatibility of cedar with its slow growth and everything with our classic deadless monocultures. So for all those reasons, seems to be less of it on the landscape, and so mapping it and identifying where it is existing is important in how this study came to be. Okay, so what is the study? The idea is to create a classification model using information from the UAV LiDAR and multispectral imagery to distinguish between western red cedar and other tree species, specifically in the TV watershed experiment. Now I'm going to dig into methods. So ground data. So we actually had two different study areas. Most of the plots, and the plots are indicated in these little dots on the maps. Most of the plots were within the TC watershed experiment that I've mentioned a few times by now. And those boundaries are indicated in these brown polygons, but a handful of plots were also outside of the experiment. So I'm just gonna call that whole area the Olympic Experimental State Forest, OESF. So when I say OESF, throughout this presentation, I'm referring to the plots that are, and I'll talk a little bit more about these plots in the next slide, but they're all within this yellow square on the map, and they are all just an hour or so south of here. And then the other place that we had plots was the Olympic National Forest. This was down outside of Hump Tulips, down where this little orangey type colored square is. And a goal with the Olympic National Forest, or ONF plots, was to get cedars of larger sizes. We realized in hindsight that we did achieve that, but we also got information on just like totally different forest types of like different composition and structure as well. So these two areas are very different, and this is a theme that comes up later, and so I'm spending a little bit more time on it. On your left is a picture from the OESF. This is your plastic stand managed by the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, primarily for timber for the trust lands, and it contains trees that are about 40 to 60 years old, primarily Douglas fir and western hemlock. And then on the right, we have a picture from the Olympic National Forest, which the cedars were significantly bigger, about 150 to 250 centimeters diameter. And you can see it's a much more open canopy, like old growth characteristics, and primarily western red cedar and western hemlock. A little bit more about that ground data, what actually was in the tree plots that we established. Oops, here we go. So we have data on 60 mixed species tree plots that was taken back in 2021, and then 27 cedar specifics where we went out and tried to find cedars and establish tree plots where they were back in 2023. And for each of our tree plots, we had information on the location of the tree plot using what's called a developed trend 2, which is just a GPS unit essentially. We have species identification of all of the tree species in the plot, the diameter at best height, the size of the trees, and the distance and azimuths of all trees in the plot to a center point of the plot. And the distance and azimuth of all trees in the plot is important to make what are called stem maps. And these stem maps I'll talk about a little bit more in a couple of slides, but they allow us to link our ground data to remote sensing data, which is important to be able to model information outside of our immediate plot boundaries. I'm going to go into the modeling methods a bit more. This is going to be a very conceptual overview slide of just generally how all of the modeling works. We take our field data, we have those stem maps, the locations of the trees within a plot, and we combine it with the spatial location of where the plot actually is. And then we've got our remote sensing data. So in this case, a LiDAR and a multispectral imagery. So we take all those things and we line them up and match each individual tree that we took data on in the field to an individual tree in the LiDAR or the multispectral imagery. And then from there, what we can do is pull metrics from the remote sensing data. So for the LiDAR, it typically has to do with point intensity values or height-related metrics like height in the 90th percentile. For the multispectral imagery, this may be the different colors, like for instance, what we can do once we match the trees from the field to trees in the multispectral imagery, because we know from the field that say this tree in the imagery is a western red cedar and this other tree is a hemlock. And then we know from the multispectral, say like what values are associated with the western red cedar in the blue band, what blue values you get compared to the western hemlock. And you can start to correlate your variables from your remote sensing data to, in this case, the species from your field data. And then what you can do with that information is train a model that they can predict information outside of your immediate ground plots. So in this case, we had, was it 60 mixed species plots and 27 cedar specific plots, which are all, only 10 meters in radius, but we also have about 10% of the T3 watershed experiment, which is 20,000 acres, so 10%, about 2,000 acres covered with our LiDAR data, for instance. So then even though we have only 60 some plots worth of field data, we can predict information to the full extent of our LiDAR data, which is a much greater area coverage. So I'm gonna do another conceptual design here on this slide, but here is an example of what the STEM map might look like. We've got plot center, and then we've got individual trees in the plot, and because we know the distance in azimuth from each tree to the plot center, we can tell where the trees are in space. And then we can connect that to, this is what's called, in the background here, a LiDAR canopy height model. It's basically if you can think about laying a blanket over the forest, it changes your 3D point cloud into a 2D master, 2D image. And like the other LiDAR point clouds, this is colored by height, where we have the blue is the ground, and then these darker yellows and kind of oranges are the trees. So you can see the outlines here of tree canopies. And so we can take a STEM map and line it up with these tree canopies. And then we can use that information to predict information to the full extent of the LiDAR's data outside of the plots. And we can, use information about things in here that we know from the field to predict information about the trees over here. And in this case, the information we're trying to predict is which trees are western red cedars. I'm gonna go over a little bit more specific of the general steps for this study, and I'll go into these more in the next few slides. But for the matching of ground data to remote sensing, I did this in 2 steps. First, just to match moving the plots as a whole to LiDAR height models, and then I did an individual tree level matching where I matched each individual tree from the field to a tree in the LiDAR multispectral imagery. Extract metrics for each of those. Use that information to train a classification model. Use that classification model to again map outside plots. This example of matching the ground plots with canopy height models, kind of like that conceptual diagram I showed, that each one of these blue dots is a tree from the field. Again, this background's canopy height model. The darker colors are higher points, so you can make out like this is a canopy, this is a canopy, this is a tree, or like tree canopy. And here, I'm going to show everything just kind of needed moved a couple of meters from where the pure GPS location that we got from our GPS unit versus where the trees are in reality or in the remote sensing data, everything just kind of needed shifted. And then I did the same thing, but on an individual tree level. This is just, again, a top-down view of the LiDAR. Each little dot is a tree. The top image is before the shifting, bottom is after. So you can see the dots didn't move that much, but they moved a little bit. And they moved enough, especially with this higher resolution data. And what I did is I matched for each tree in the LiDAR where the tree bottom and where the tree top was, which was important information because in T3, it is very slopey and there's a lot of steep slopes. And so the trees tend to lean. And if you have leaning trees and you think that the tree top is here, or you know that a tree top is here, but your tree is leaning, and you try and get information on the full tree, but you just go straight down, you're not actually getting information on that tree. So you need to know the tree lean to be able to properly extract all of the points that are associated with that tree. And then what did that extraction look like? This got slightly complicated because I was curious if extracting from the entire tree, what I'm calling a small cylinder, so taking all the points in the LiDAR for each tree in that full small cylinder, if that would work better in modeling, or just using the top 3 meters, which we found from a previous study with Douglas fir versus Western hemlock, it worked better just to take the top 3 meters of trees. I did both of those things and then did different model combinations. This is cool. This is examples of what those top 3 meter clips look like. So on your far left, you have a Western cedar tree. In the middle, Western hemlock. You can kind of see that droopy top. And then on the right, we've got a Douglas fir tree. And it's really encouraging that as humans, we can kind of make out these shapes and make out these species. Because as a general rule of thumb, if you can see a pattern as a human, you can train a computer to also see that pattern. This is the same thing of extracting metric, but from multispectral imagery. This is an example of false color imagery. Each circle is a tree, and for each tree, I just use an estimated crown diameter to extract data on the multispectral imagery for that tree. Okay, and then what you do with all those metrics, all that data for each tree, where you know for the LiDAR metrics and for the multispectral imaging metrics, what species it's associated with. We made a bunch of models. So used a machine learning algorithm, random forest, to make a classification model. We had a bunch of different data combinations, so I ended up developing 10 different models. So things got a little bit complicated. We have a combination of 2023 plots, which were cedar-specific plots that were primarily cedars and western hemlocks, and then 2021 data, which was primarily Douglas fir and western hemlock. And then we had multispectral imagery, but only for the 2023 plots that were western hemlock and western cedar. And for those 2023 plots, there was also those 2 different study areas. And then I also took information metrics from the small cylinder of a tree versus the top 3 meters. So basically things got really complicated fast, and we wanted to know like different combinations of things, how that impacted the model. And so I ended up making 10 models with different combinations of just using the LiDAR, because we had data from 2021 and 2023, so more data that was LiDAR, and then the LiDAR and multispectral imagery, which we only had multispectral imagery for the 2023 plots. Combinations of like both of the 2 different study areas and then individually, and then also combinations of like extracting metrics from the full cylinder versus the top 3 meters. So what were the results of all of this chaos? We had models ranging from 78 to 87% accuracies, which is pretty good. Your accuracies in this type of like species identification really depend on the species in question. Like if you're taking a deciduous tree and comparing it to an evergreen tree, that is a lot easier than taking 2 evergreen trees and trying to compare them. It really helps with this drone LiDAR, which is really high resolution, to be able to do this, like using airborne LiDAR, which is a lot fewer points. You might not get enough information at each individual tree level to be able to distinguish between the species. So in general, these model accuracies were pretty good. Some general patterns that seem to occur. The models definitely improved in accuracy when separated by study area. The top 3 meters generally performed better. I think in one model it performed worse, but for the rest it did better. And then adding the multispectral imagery produced mixed results. It helped half the time, didn't help the other half the time. And then what we consider kind of our most robust model, the model with the highest accuracy that had the most data, was our OESF area only, top 3 meters, LiDAR only model. This is a list of all the final accuracies. I'm not gonna really dig into it. This is the one that we like the most, that would use in other, to apply to other data or to predict data. And so what can we get with all of this modeling? Well, this is the final results of a map. Here we've got on the x-axis, these are x coordinates, y-axis, y coordinates. So this is an actual area in space. Each individual dot is a tree that was automatically segmented using the LiDAR. And then each point is colored based on whether the model predicted it to be western red cedar, which is red, or not a western red cedar, which is in black. And so it's encouraging to see, like, we know what we know of these forests, but it's pretty dense, and that doesn't have a lot of cedar, and cedar tends to grow near other cedar. It's also reflected in the model results. It's always nice when what you think is reality and what the model thinks is reality lines up. And when it doesn't line up, then you have to start asking questions. Some major takeaways. So the LiDAR and multispectral imagery did indeed seem to be useful in detecting cedars. There was a big dependence on the forest age and structure, those two study areas. Combining them really decreased model accuracy, keeping them separate help things, which makes sense because if you have a more narrow view of things, it's just easier to train data to a data set that has smaller variance than if you have a much more complicated thing that you're trying to explain. Potential uses for these models, you have maps, obviously locations for tribes and other stakeholders, species models when other methods are not feasible at scale. So this is really important specifically for T3, which is a 20,000 acre study. We just don't have the money and the manpower to put in enough ground plots to be able to say statistical analyses at that scale without remote sensing, where we can use remote sensing to scale up to the extent of remote sensing. And then finally, you could do some biogeography of cedar studies, looking at, okay, we have these predicted maps of where we think cedar is that tied to other things like, say, nearby streams, water, slope aspect, other variables. So that was all about the Crescent Red Cedar study in particular. Now I'm just going to take a step back and talk about general benefits of remote sensing in forestry and some challenges. And this is like the overview slides of remote sensing, definitely not a comprehensive look at all the benefits and challenges. It's just like things to keep in mind. One huge benefit is that you get data on larger spatial scales. Like I keep saying, you're able to use the models to find information outside of your immediate ground plots. And that information is wall-to-wall data coverage. And it can be used to track and analyze information over time. So if you have an area that you want to fly like once every 5 years, you can, and then you can look at the changes between the imagery, between the LiDAR in that amount of time. And really all that allows you to do is ask new questions that you maybe couldn't ask before. So it's not, I like to think of it not as like a replacement per se of like, you know, ground plots or surveys, because you always are going to need those ground plots and surveys to be able to validate your remote sensing data. But really, remote sensing is an augmentation or an extension that allows you to ask questions that you couldn't necessarily before. Some challenges and some drawbacks, considerations with remote sensing. You really do need high quality ground truthing data, including spatial data to connect it to the LiDAR. For instance, you might look at like this picture of a LiDAR point cloud. This kind of a side view over here of different trees. And you might look at that and think like, oh, I know all the trees in this area because I can see them in the LiDAR. But the reality is, like with this, which is from drone LiDAR, that LiDAR was flown over the canopies. And you can only see as deep as the laser pulses were able to penetrate into the canopy, which is pretty good. But you can see like kind of in the bottom of this image, the pulse density, the point density really decreases the farther into the canopy you get. And so you might have like smaller trees down here, and especially if you have a really dense canopy, you're not going to be able to see those trees in the LiDAR. And unless you go on the ground, you may not know that those trees exist, or you may not know the size of those trees, and you can't take into account those trees. So with all the possibilities of remote sensing, you always got to keep in mind the ground truthing and going on the ground to make sure that what you're seeing in whatever remote sensing you're looking at is actually what you think it is. Another challenge or consideration is that the model you're making is only as good as the data you give it. If you give a model biased data, you're gonna get a biased model. For instance, in this case, I was looking at cedar trees versus not cedar trees, because obviously there's a lot more not cedars than there are cedar trees in existence. And let's say you have a data set that's 80% not cedar and 20% cedar. If you feed that to these machine learning algorithms, they're gonna look at that and be like, okay, so if you give me a tree, probability wise, it's just not gonna be a cedar, right? Because there's just more not cedars. And so then it'll, be more likely to pick not cedar because that is what you told it is more likely to happen, just probability wise. And so then if you were to train a model using that data and try to apply it elsewhere, it's more likely to say something's not a cedar when in that elsewhere area that you're applying it, maybe that's not true, when we do have a lot of cedars. And so and for this study, for instance, what I did is I downsampled my not cedar trees and randomly selected one so that I had the same number of not cedars as cedars. So those are the things those types of biases are just things to keep in mind to either fix before you train a model or to know when you're training it and trying to apply it elsewhere to take into consideration of what did you give this computer, because depending on what you give the computer, it's gonna react accordingly. Which also feeds into my next point, that models should be well understood before transferring or applying them elsewhere. For instance, if you train a model on like the OASF data, which is kind of a mid-sterile forest of, mostly Douglas firs and western hemlocks, if you take it over to an extreme would be to eastern Washington and tried it on a bunch of ponderosa pines, it's gonna still give you some things that it calls cedars because that's what you trained it to do with specific metrics and things that come up, but your accuracy is not gonna be good at all, right? And you're not gonna realize that because you were, told that you were given a model of accuracy 85%. But that's only 85% if you apply it into similar areas than what the model was trained on. So you can definitely do it. It's just not gonna work as well, which might still be valuable, might not, depends on the situation. And then my final point is that remote sensing can be limited in what it can see, which goes back to if you have remote sensing that's flying above the canopy, it's going to see the canopy really well, not below the canopy. If you have terrestrial LiDAR that's below the canopy, it's going to be able to see below the canopy really well, not the canopy. Yeah, that's all I had. Thank you so much to everyone who's listed on the screen, and thank you also so much for listening. Any questions?
That last point you made me think, what if you could combine drone technology with artificial intelligence so you could fly under the canopy and maneuver so that you could actually train the drone to actually fly under the canopy looking perhaps up, solve a lot of these problems. I think the technology is actually not that far away to be able to do that.
That'd be really cool.
Situations. Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
Can you identify the tree diameter of these maps? I work for Rural Natural Resources, and the individual who leads our Sierra Harvest has said that there's a particular diameter tree that's the best for actually stripping burn off.
Yeah, we can estimate diameters based on height, because we really get height information from the LiDAR. So for all of the points that we have, this is gonna take a second. For all of the points, all of these points of predicted locations, individual points came from the LiDAR automatic segmentation. And so for each of these points, even the black ones that are not cedar trees, we have the height of the tree at that point. And so you could use that to estimate diameter. And we do have for the tribe, we ask, the Philly Natural Resources Department, what is your minimum diameter? And so for that, we can, make a map like this and then say, okay, we're gonna drop the trees under a certain height, so things are not gonna meet the diameter requirement. Yeah.
Could you speak more on the variables that you use to create this model? I don't know, is it more about the richness, like the ratio of the cedar to the other, like in the community composition that you were using to help predict that? Or what other variables were you using?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was a lot of variables, which is why I don't talk about it as much. But basically, so the composition was actually something that I tried to control, and I downsampled like all of the species that were not suited to try and keep the species equal across the model, so that then it could be applied and not predict things based on species composition was the goal. Which you could do a different way for sure. And for the LiDAR, okay. For the LiDAR, most of the metrics had to either do with intensity, primarily mean intensity. So the mean, LiDAR points reflect back with a certain like amount, they're just called intensity. So the mean intensity for all the points within a tree. And then, so that's one big thing. And another big thing for LiDAR is height. And so all of those points have a certain height associated with them, and what you can do is heights at different percentiles, different ratios, so kind of getting at structure almost, of like there's concentrations of points up here compared to less points up here, or like concentrations of points in the middle, or like just different, distribution of points. I'm trying to go back, this was like way further in the beginning than I thought it was. Okay, multispectral imagery. These were the metrics. So these indices, and these indices were different combinations of the bands. So for instance, NDVI stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It's just a very common index within the field, and it's good for identifying vegetation. And it's a combination of the near infrared bands and the red bands. And these are, there's a lot of different indices. I think there's like 8 different multispectral indices, which were just different combinations of the bands. And so for the modeling, it's all multivariate, where you feed it all of these different variables, all of the multispectral, all of the LiDAR at the same time. And then you can, with the modeling, you can ask the model like, oh, what were your top 5 variables, your top 5 predictors that came out as the biggest things to distinguish cedar from non-cedar. And so I did that, and I removed all the correlated variables and used for these models the top 5 metrics for me to use.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question online, can I ask it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the question is from I Like Trees. They asked, was there anything that you were surprised by? Did you expect there would be more or less cedars?
I think it wasn't, there was nothing in the end that was overly surprising. Oh, except I guess adding the multispectral to the models helped increased accuracy half the time and decreased accuracy the other half of the time. And that I was kind of surprised by. I thought that the multispectral imagery would always help the models, particularly once separated by site. Because I knew the multispectral imagery was pretty different at the 2 sites, but I thought that taking that into account within each site, that adding multispectral imagery would help generally. But then I dug more into the literature, and it does seem that depending on your model, adding multispectral imagery doesn't always help. So I think it's a classic thing of sometimes you think that more data is better, and then you add the data and you think about it and you realize probably depends on the situation. Yeah. That's a great question. Behind Teddy Forest and then Teddy, yeah, there's that.
So I have a couple different questions actually. So first off, with the multispectral, do you think it was sort of an overfitting error when you added it in? Like, was it that the multispectral data was bad, or that it was good and the model was just like overfitting to trees that weren't actually cedars and saying like that's cedar?
That's a good question. I think, to be honest, I think the multispectral, it wasn't that it was good or bad, it was more that it just wasn't that much better than some of the LiDAR metrics. I mentioned that I used the top 5 predictors for each model, and for the ones that included multispectral imagery, one predictor was always a multispectral imagery predictor. But I think it was just that, so, you're doing the top 5 and you're dropping the ones below it. And yes, in the top 5, there's a multispectral imagery one, but it wasn't still that much better than one, like the 6th most important one there was a LiDAR one, if that makes sense. So, which to me indicates too, is that if you just had multispectral, you could also probably do this work. But if you had the choice between multispectral and LiDAR, or if you just had LiDAR, you probably good enough with the LiDAR alone.
And then, I know maybe people in here are getting AI fatigue, but
Yeah.
you know, classifiers, I know there've been like big improvements in their performance, like especially over 2021 compared to now. Have you seen improvements in like your applications for them?
Yeah, it's interesting. The one that I use for this study, the algorithm, it's called random forest, and it's been used for past like couple of decades. So it was not a new one. The classic ones you usually see within forestry and within species identification are random forest, support vector machine, maximum likelihood, I think. And those have all been around for the last decade or two. The newer one is convolutional neural networks. And what I've seen from those compared to the other ones is that sometimes they help, but usually only by a couple of percentages. And the problem, well, not problem, like the downside to some of the newer technology, I feel like, is it's more of a like a black box where you have less understanding of what it's doing. With random forest, they consider it more like a gray box where you have some understanding, like I could pull the top 5 predictors, and you have some level of what is this computer algorithm doing. Whereas the newest stuff, it's more like you give it all to the computer, it does its fancy stuff behind the screen, and it spits out results. But in general, I'd say a couple things. One, it doesn't seem to help much from what I've seen in the literature, but also two, I feel like it's gonna take a second to catch up, and I think 5 years down the line from now, it might be a different answer. So I think it may just be thinking a good chunk.
And then just, you know, there's been, Amazon or Microsoft is like getting nuclear power for their training for their AI. So just how much time and cost does like one of these models take to train for you guys? I'm taking, you don't need nuclear things for it. but-
No, luckily not. That's really cool though. Honestly, the thing that took the longest was to be able to do like well, I'm not gonna flip back to it, that's gonna take too much time. But to do like the map of the little black and red dots, to be able to predict onto those trees, I needed to process all of the LiDAR data to the full extent. And that took a while, but a while was like a couple of days of the computer just chugging along and automatically segmenting and taking metrics on all the LiDAR trees. So it's not, that was the longest part, and it wasn't too bad. And now that the models are made, it only takes, depending on what you're running it on and what you'd be predicting on, I think the whole thing, I can usually get it done like 10 minutes or less. It's not that bad, but this is not like comparatively not that big of a data set compared to some of the stuff that's happening. Yeah, which helps a lot. Great questions.
We also have a question online from Neil, who I think would like to unmute. Hey Neil, are you ready to ask your question? You can unmute and ask it in real time.
Can you hear me? Yes or no? I'm unmuted, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Okay, so I was walking through my woods today and I've been having top-down cedar problems for a couple of decades. And I saw there were some new trees. So since you're talking about the top 5 feet you're using to do your, are you able to tell if a tree's being stressed in the top 5 feet and get a record of that? And then are you able to record as you do the whole tree with a LiDAR further down as the tree is being stressed and degenerating further down? And then are you able to get an understanding if it's the top's blown out for your records? It's just kind of, my thought is there a way to tell if the whole tree is gotten stressed and the whole tree has just died suddenly from one year to the next? Are you able to do that with this research, or is it are we too early on the front part of the curve for this to know?
Good question. You can definitely with multispectral imagery in general see dead trees, and same as LiDAR. Maybe we'll try and go back. Specifically with our Olympic National Forest plots, there was a surprising number of cedars that had dead tops. And cedar, the health of cedar was something that we actually tried to record in the field. And then realized later that we couldn't see up high enough in the canopy to really accurately record all the dead tops. And so that we ended up basically dropping that data, which was unfortunate. But you can really, oh, here we go. In this photo, I'll use my cursor for people online, but in this point cloud, you can see dead tops. So like this stick is a dead top. This little stick is also a dead top. Same over here and over here. You can't necessarily tell. Well, I would have to do. You'd have to do a whole study on it. I don't know how deep you can tell stress. I think one takeaway from this study is that more information on the dead and dying cedars and how they look in the LiDAR and multispectral imagery would be really cool and really useful. Because it seems like you can see them, but we need, I think, more of a targeted study, particularly with the ground data. Yeah, that was a good question. Oh, yes, City.
So your best performing or the chosen model at 85% accuracy, does that differ depending on whether you were trying to identify a smaller tree or a larger tree? The stands are very different in the OSF and the second row forest, with most of the cedars being fairly small, not as big as the ONRC trees.
Yeah, so the 85% was actually just from the OESF, and I think that that's part of the reason. Well, okay, I think multiple things. One is that I think part of the reason why the two different sites perform so differently, and when we combined both sites together, the models decreased in accuracy so much, is because the cedars did play different roles in the different sites. And so what they looked like in the LiDAR as a result was different. And I also think that's the cedars in the OESF, that yes, typically are slightly shorter than surrounding trees. That's why the top 3 meters tended to perform better, just taking those top 3 meters, because I think that particularly for the cedars, there tended to be less points that penetrated deep enough in the canopy to get like a really good profile of the full cedar. In general, the 85% accuracy is across all the cedars, not cedars within the OESF, which most of them was slightly shorter than the other trees. So theoretically, there's not something that I could tell you based on the accuracy. Basically, is if you're a smaller tree, whether or not you would be higher, like it would be less accurate on a smaller tree. I could think that it'd probably be fine because most of the trees were like that.
Then a slightly different question.
Yes.
So what will be the transferability of this model to any stand that differs from what you trained it on?
Yeah, see, that is the question. And I feel like that's always the question with these types of models. It's gonna be definitely less accurate. To the extent of which is less accurate, I think you'd have to get ground data to validate. Yeah, I would expect in like the vast majority of the T3 stands, which are all pretty similar, it's gonna, the 85%, like that one model is gonna work well with 85%, but as soon as you take it outside of that, yeah, this is gonna decrease.
To just kind of build on that, is this kind of an example where expanding the model into including like more of a multivariate model where you're training in also correlative, like exogenous factors, like environmental parameters that you find are correlated with the presence or absence of those cedars might help apply it to different stands potentially?
You could definitely do that. Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of different ways you could go with the model. Like there's a lot of different variables that I I could have fed into the model from the beginning that are also related, cedar or not cedar. I think partly I was worried, well, I was really worried about things getting too complicated. And I was also probably worried, because cedar is so random sometimes. Like, I feel like in the literature even, it seemed like, oh, it's like more shade tolerant. And then other places would be like, oh, it can be shade intolerant. Like, it seemed to me at least, like some of these things was still getting figured out. And so I was thinking, oh, might as well do just the drone LiDAR and imagery, and then maybe we can correlate afterwards to the other variables instead of doing the opposite. But I think you could definitely do that too. And I think it would be interesting. Yeah.
We have one more question from folks on Zoom, and this is from Jill Silver.
Yeah.
She says, segueing off Neil's question on broken tops makes me think about topographic protection from wind. Wondering about how the landscape position might be correlated to detection of western red cedar with broken tops. Also, the older western red cedar often have multiple spires. Did your models see those too? And then she said, talk about too complicated. I don't need to read it all. Sorry, Bill.
Those are great questions, Jill. Okay, so to the first one with the topographic, okay, I think something really, really interesting with the cedars and the broken tops, which is not like there's not been like an official study done on this. You can't say this with like a ton of confidence, but I think it's a really interesting theory that came out of, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's a group at WSU Puyallup who's been doing a lot of work on cedars and then healthy cedars. And they went around and took data on a bunch of healthy cedars, a bunch of unhealthy cedars, and they were looking specifically also to see if there's like a disease or something else that was causing the problem. And basically, one of the observations that they found is that the cedars that tended to be more in the open seemed worse than cedars that were even next door to the unhealthy cedar that was more exposed to wind, sunlight, what have you, than a cedar that was next door to it but buried in the canopy. And they were postulating, they were thinking that that was because the cedars that were more in the open were more exposed to sunlight, which increased the transpiration from the leaves, which increased the drought within the trees. And because we know the drought is, we know from the WSU people that it seems like the droughts were correlated with the unhealthy cedar and the less cedar growth. These trees that are more exposed to the wind and to the sunlight, the wind making the transpiration even more exposed to the sunlight, that was causing unhealthy cedars. And I kind of feel like that explains some of why in the ONF, the Olympic National Forest data set here, there's a lot of dead tops with these really, really tall cedars compared to the OASF, which had cedars that were more within canopies, and the cedars tended to be shorter than the surrounding trees, and also tended to, it seemed like, be healthier, and there was no dead tops in those cedars. There's also, though, a lot of confounding factors, like with the Olympic National Forest, you also get older trees, which just have more trouble getting water up to the top of them regardless. So that could also be causing the dead tops. But yeah, I think the position of the cedars within a stand is a really interesting question. And I think there's a lot more research, interesting future research. And then I think to your second point, Jill, about the Canderalphus that cedar does, that I think we didn't have enough. The really only cedars that we had that were doing that were within the Olympic National Forest, and we didn't really have enough of them to use that. But I'm sure that within the LiDAR, those weird shapes, specifically for the ONF data and the ONF models, that was like taken into account with the different LiDAR metrics. It would have been reflected in that.
I have a general question about multispectral. Can it see mycorrhizal density or activity?
Nope, not at all. That would be really cool. No, unfortunately, you can only see above ground. And it really, the red edge and near infrared, which are the multispectral bands that I use, it really, again, it comes down to how much the plant is photosynthesizing. That piece is just a reflection, but it can't. It's not X-rays. It can't see through things, and it can't look anywhere else. Good questions.
Yeah, well, we're a few minutes after 8, so I think we can wrap up, but I think Ally could probably stick around if there are more questions and we can talk more one-on-one. But yeah, thank you all for coming. It was a great presentation. I also wanted to just thank Tom Rosmond and the Rosmond Family Education Fund for supporting the evening talks. And I'll make one more pitch that we have another upcoming talk on November 12th around earthquake monitoring, and then another one in December, and that will wrap up our fall series. And then around the new year, we'll send you all another mailer for the winter/spring series, which will run January through May. Yeah, well, thank you all for coming, and yeah, thanks for participating, Ally. And
So if people are interested in remote sensing, ONRC and OESF, we just published a newsletter, our fall electronic newsletter that has 2 articles, popular science articles on remote sensing. One is identifying western hemlock and Douglas fir using remote sensing, and the other is very interesting PhD research on identifying forest wetlands. So we'll be there on our website, ONRC and OESF.
yeah, thanks, Betty. All right, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks,
everyone. Thanks, folks online.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Teddy. Thanks, Ally. Good night.
Thanks, good night.